important elements that and also challenging issues forestry governance in Indonesia is actually on tenure issues. And it has been also acknowledged in the flag PPA that tenure issue is tenure clarification is a really important element in legality verification. And in Indonesia, unlike many tropical countries, we have really complex tenure arrangement. Almost only around 10% of Indonesian forest government forest area actually have clear tenure arrangement. And many of the smallholders that become part of the SPLK system actually do not have land titles. So there is ongoing debates on to what extent SPLK need to address tenure clarification. But based on our discussion with key informant and as well as the review from the documents, there is also little evidence that SPLK can contribute to to stimulate the progress of tenure clarification in Indonesia. Currently, the SPLK legality checklist only require documentation showing the clarity of the origin of the timber, permit for timber harvesting if they are harvested from the state forest area, or also land ownership if they harvest in the privately owned forest, especially for smallholders forest owners. In other words, it only focuses on the presence of appropriate documentation, regardless how they have been obtained. And this situation has been criticized by many civil society activists, and I think in early 2015, the government tried to revise the SPLK system by include the principle of forest free, prior and informed consent in obtaining the sustainable forest management certification, which is part of SPLK actually. But there is no information as yet that how this EPIC principle is actually implemented and how they audit the implementation of the EPIC in the obtaining the license and operating the timber harvesting. So the decision, Indonesia is pretty unique because SPLK is actually audited by the third-party auditors, and the decision to delegate the legality verification to third-party auditor was supported by European Union and also many key informants. We interviewed policy research. They argue that it is actually a real strategic avenue to improve the credibility of the system, considering Indonesia has suffered negative reputation in corruption and also mismanagement of the forest resources. However, two key informants that we interviewed, especially one of them actually already engaged since the beginning of the SPLK development, and the other is actually certifier. They mentioned that the approach is ill-suited for Indonesian system, especially because SPLK hugely focus on the EU market incentive, which is considered only less than 5% on the overall timber export. So this is the figure for timber export. Most of the wood export in Indonesia actually go to Asian countries, especially China, and so European countries is actually only comprised of less than 5%. So they mentioned that implementing a nationwide system for timber legality verification solely based on EU market incentive will not be compelling enough to timber brands to follow through the mechanism. Another contentious issues in SPLK is whether or not it needs to include smallholders in the system. The smallholders and small and medium enterprises in Indonesia actually really important players. There are almost 7 to 11 households in 11 million households in Java alone planting trees and harvesting trees, mostly for domestic consumption. And for small and medium enterprises, even though the actual number actually much higher because many of them are not registered formally in the association. So initially, SPLK actually include all of the timber players regardless the size, including smallholders and small medium enterprises. But again, it was initially it was also criticized by civil society activists. In 2014, the government of Indonesia decided to relax the requirement by excluding small and medium enterprises and also smallholders. The smallholders only required to have a self-declaration document that they own sign and mentioning they got the timber from the legal sources. And also for small and medium enterprises, they initially required to issue export declaration document, but by the end of last year, they are not required to prove anything to export the timber products. Yes, almost done. So there are two different views on the relaxation of the SPLK. One group actually opposed the relaxation. They mentioned that the system, to make it credible, the system needs to cover all players, timber players. It should not be discriminatory. If there is an issue with getting technical and also financial support, it is the government responsibility to provide that. But it's not a reason. This is not a legitimate reason to exclude the timber from the system, smallholders from the system. But the other group actually opposed the inclusion of the smallholders in the SPLK. They mentioned that the inclusion of smallholders is not really economically feasible for smallholders to obtain any benefit. It's really costly. For getting one certification is only it costs almost 100 million rupiah, which is very big in Indonesian standard, and it makes them actually getting even smaller fraction of the benefit that they currently get. Oh, sorry. But we also interviewed the representative from smallholders, and surprisingly, we have mixed reaction. One of the representative especially mentioned that he regrets after all of the years they actually put efforts and energy to obtain the certification. The government just remove the requirement. They already got the certification. They feel that it benefits them to improve the forest management because by obtaining the certification, they are required to develop a long-term management plan, and it actually in some way helping them, and it also helped them to access for the government subsidy for loan and others support. But this is actually an exception rather than the rule, because the rest of the smallholder actually mentioned that even though they already get the certification, legality certification, they don't accept any tangible benefit. So, in conclusion, many lessons to be learned from Indonesia experience of TPA process and SPLK. In Indonesia's case, legality verification does not simply reinforce state authority, nor does it certify legality, but it involves a unique blend of public and private authority that define and narrows the scope of who and what considered as legal. Under the Indonesian SPLK, the state has set official boundaries of what laws and regulations are included in legality standard, and has delegated the task of auditing compliance to third-party auditors. And the state-based legality verification involves some degree of commodification, in which both rely on standardization and auditing process to create interchangeable levels of sustainability or legality. We also found that the legality verification system in Indonesia has limited ability to address corruption, as well as resource tenure qualification. In addition, it also has largely excluded small-scale operators for benefit of getting legal recognition. So some ideas for moving forward. Instead of requiring that all projects legality, such approach might be better restrict to large-scale wood exporter and reframe it as evidence of due diligence rather than legality. In addition, improving forest governance for domestic and small producers could better be achieved through legal reform combined with other non-regulatory approaches that prioritize the jure and de facto recognition of community rights to access and benefit from the local resources. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Rita, for getting us off to a great start with very clear results and I think some issues that are obviously much wider than just particular case studies that you discussed. So look forward to coming back to that in discussion. And you mentioned the importance of tenure in the context of Indonesian forest, and that's a very good segue to take us to Rebecca's presentation, which will focus about aspects of land law and tenure in West Java. So Rebecca, please.
Like the previous presenter, as well as Connie, I'm working on issues of land tenure, formalization of rights within Indonesia, but my lens is slightly different as well as the time frame that I'm looking at. I'm not looking at afterwards of formalization of rights and how that impacts these communities, because this constitutional court ruling that I'm looking at through this case study has been passed by the Constitutional Court, but it has not yet been implemented. And so I'm looking at the process leading up to these the formalization of rights and how the community's access to its natural resources might change over time based on this formalization of rights. This fieldwork was carried out in the areas of Jakarta, Bogor, Sukabumi, and Lebak with the Kesepuan Adat community, which follows customary law. And this community has relatively insecure statutory rights, but fairly secure customary rights for access and use of the forest. They even have a formalized system of buying and selling use rights among community members. They're also, which complicates the situation, they're located in a conservation zone. This is part of Gunung Halimun Salak National Park. And conflict within this case study existed at many levels. So there's actors at the national level, including the Ministry of Forestry and the national level NGOs. There's also regional level actors, provincial and district level government officials, national park officers, and regional NGOs. And then there's also conflict within the local level as well. So the Kesepuan community that I'll be explaining a bit more about is an ethnic group, but there are several villages within this group, so there's often conflict amongst the different communities based on, some have recognition from the government as an indigenous community, and some of them do not, and so this does create some tension between the communities. The research questions that I was looking at, in particular with regard to this chapter of my dissertation, within the dissertation I'm also looking at issues of participatory mapping projects, as well as differentiated citizenship, so how claiming indigeneity gives you different rights based on this indigenous status. But for this particular paper, I was looking at how customary and statutory law systems interact, accommodate, and intertwine in the everyday lives of forest-dwelling communities, how these legal systems impact forest use and access to these needed natural resources, and then how do community members navigate pluralistic legal systems that govern their use of the forest where they live. Working within a framework of legal pluralism and the idea that, especially in post-colonial spaces, but certainly other areas, pluralistic systems of law exist. These systems are generally regarded as legitimate, such as religious law, or in this case, customary law, and they can influence different realms of life and at other times, conflicting realms. But generally, legal pluralism studies focus on multiple systems of law, whereas this presentation presents the idea that legal pluralism in land law in Indonesia is relatively rare between customary and statutory legal systems, but rather that the pluralism exists in the statutory system primarily, where competing laws are routinely passed that overlap and conflict. The research found that with regard to legal systems, customary law provides greater security to the Muslim community, despite its lack of power at the national level, and that the statutory system, even with such promising rulings as MK-05, which is the constitutional court ruling that I'll be discussing, is a source of confusion and broken promises for community members, and furthermore that statutory laws are often in conflict with each other and are enforced on an ad hoc basis for the greatest advantage of the provincial, district, or national level enforcer, which further weakens its power at the local level. Quickly, just to outline the presentation, I'll be looking at the statutory law concerning land and forest in Indonesia, and then going into adat law concerning land and forest, the ways that these systems interact, and also looking at the pluralistic nature of the laws that impact life in the forests of Indonesia. Finally, because this law has not yet been implemented, I also made some suggestions for policy in the future if this law is actually to be implemented. I will not give you all the details because the basis of my presentation is that it's confusing and conflicting. So I will not give you all of these confusing and conflicting laws, but I will give you the basis of forest law in Indonesia and land law. And so according to Basic Act 1945, Article 33, this gives control of earth, soil, water, and wealth contained therein to the state to be used as it sees fit to contribute to the welfare of the population. And later, forest lands in particular were granted through Law Number 41 of 1999 on forestry and Law Number 5 of 1990 on living forests or living resources in their ecosystem. So regardless of human occupants, the central Indonesian government has claimed more than 96% of the country's forested land, and a large proportion of this has been declared protected areas and national parks, as well as concessions for logging and plantation forests, which are sold to corporations. This also includes forest lands that actually do not have forests on them, because once an area is zoned as forest, the Ministry of Forestry is reluctant to rezone those areas because they would then lose control over that land to the National Land Agency. It also tends within Indonesia to oscillate between a decentralization and re-centralization. Most recently, there's a return to centralization with the passing of law in 2014 that took away the ability of provincial and regional governments to grant forest concessions. So again, there's not a whole lot has been done on this, but we'll see in the future how this impacts forest use. The specific law that ruling that I'm looking at is the Constitutional Court Ruling 35/2012. It's referred to in Indonesia as MK-05, and so if you hear me refer to that, that's how I will refer to it throughout the presentation, just because that's how my mind thinks of it, not in English. So this was passed in May of 2013 in Indonesia, and it's because it's been so recently passed, there's not been a whole lot of movement on it, but it was a really interesting point to step into the research within these communities. And the reason I chose the Kasepuan communities is because MK-05 had the Constitutional Court Review had 2 communities that signed on to this, and one of those was a Kasepuan community called Cisitu. So that's why I thought that this was an excellent community to study the impact of this, because they do have indigenous status with the Indonesian government, but other Kasapuan communities do not. So it was interesting to look at the difference and how the excitement over Ngazi Golema. And it changed the wording of the forestry law of 1999. So as you can see on the slide, the previous wording said Adat forest is a state forest situated in indigenous peoples area, and the revised wording is Adat forest is a forest situated in indigenous peoples area. So it took out that one word, state, and this has an estimated 40% of Indonesia's forest that will be impacted by this ruling if it is implemented. Moving into customary law, and in particular for this community, the Kasapuan, they claim settlement in the area since 1368, so well before VOC, Dutch, national level authorities. Their oral tradition has them as the descendants of the Pajajaran Bogor kingdom, and they're led by an Aba, which is a hereditary position, and all Adat positions are hereditary in the village, but village officials that are representatives to the government are all elected. Somewhat important for this particular presentation, but within my research, it's very important, is the fact that these communities are semi-nomadic. So this is based on Swidden agriculture, and so they move location every 10 to 15 years based on when the ancestors tell them they need to move and where they need to move. So as you'll see as I'm kind of talking about the zoning, this becomes important because sometimes they can move from an adjacent area to a core zone, which angers the national park officer. So it is important for movement of the community. This, just for reference, this is Banten and West Java provinces, Labak and Sukabumi regencies. It's 2 provinces, 3 regencies, 314 villages, over 10,000 masyarakat adat community members within the Gunung Halimun South National Park. So this is in fact, and this is just my case study. This does not even include the communities within the rest of Indonesia that this is impacting their forest and their rights. Just quickly so you can get an idea of Gunung Halimun South National Park. It's the highest biodiversity and forest cover left in Java, so this has a lot of importance for the rest of the island and also for the world in general as a conservation zone. It was created, the original mapping of the area was created by the Dutch. I think it was actually 1929, but it was put as a protected forest in 1932 based on this mapping. And that original mapping really denied the existence of any of the masyarakat adat that were living in the area. And so the communities protested, and the Dutch promised to rezone all of the area. And because of the outbreak of World War II, the Dutch never came back to rezone any of that. And once the national level government took over, they just adopted these maps without any of the rezoning that was promised. So there's still quite a bit of conflict in the area about where communities are allowed to live. In 2005, it's generally been a fence and fine approach to conservation. In 2005, it was switched officially to a participatory approach that was intended to include a lot of these indigenous community members in the governance of the park, but a lack of funding for training and also somewhat resistant by park officials means that there's really not been much done to switch to this participatory approach to management. This map, the details aren't really that important, but what I wanted to show is the confusing nature of the national park zoning. So there's been many calls for changes in the system that would limit it to 3 zones rather than the current 7, but nothing has been done on that. So you can see that there's core zones, there's special use zones, there's cultural zones, there's traditional zones, and how do you make the difference between these different zones? Because some of them are meant for living culture, some of them are meant for monuments and grave sites, so it's very confusing. Special use zones are not actually for community members, they're meant for concessions and logging companies, so it's all very confusing. Now the customary law zoning is a a bit less complicated. They use closed protected forests, entrusted forest, and use forest and land. As you can see from the map and the zoning that you have for the Adat communities, there's different types of zoning, there's different uses of these zones, and so these oftentimes overlap and conflict. So for example, you have a community member that will go and cut down a tree for firewood, and within Adat zoning, it's within a use forest, but within national park zoning, it's a core zone. So there's some conflict when forests are cut down for things like cooking firewood. So pluralism within the statutory system, there's 41 million hectares of land without forest cover, 48 million people who live in or near the forest estate, 40,000 villages within the forest estate in Indonesia. So I mean, there's just lots of room for conflict, as you can see from these the particular numbers are not that important, but just understanding that there's just a lot of room for conflict. In 2012 and 2013, there was a movement for synchronization and harmonization of land and forestry laws within the statutory system. 632 regulations and decisions were in place in 2012, and after this process of synchronization and harmonization, 208 of those were declared redundant or conflicting. And then again, after the same process in 2013, there were only 130 of these regulations that were declared valid. So that adds up to 502 overlapping, redundant, or conflicting regulations. And actually, I just read something the other day about, and this is not particular to forest or land law, but Jokowi has already canceled 3,000 redundant regulations since taking office last year. So I mean, this happens a lot, and not just forestry law. There's other areas where it's happening. Yeah. So, sorry. Back to my thesis statement that this legal pluralism in land law in Indonesia is relatively rare between customary and statutory legal systems, as commonly is believed to exist. Rather than pluralism exists in the statutory system primarily, where competing laws are routinely passed that overlap and conflict. So, reasons that I put forth that this is happening is that laws are being passed to the advantage of one party or another, and they may often contradict laws that already exist. Also, nations competing on a global stage to pass laws that represent some sort of a development, and this is often tied to funding. So if you can show that you have a law on the books, it doesn't matter whether it's implemented or not. There's not a lot of regulation around that, but rather that it's on the books, and so you can get some sort of development funding for that. And then also laws are implemented on an ad hoc basis by government officials in situations where they're the most advantageous option, which often includes bribes and monetary gifts or So moving forward on policy suggestions, and in particular to Lima, the forest law and the role of the Ministry of Forestry must be simplified and clarified with regard to the possibilities for Lima. That's huge, but there are some movement that could be made on that. There's also there needs to be widespread cancellation of redundant laws or conflicting ones concerning land and forestry. And then also clarification regarding the status of Masyarakat Adat and associated land rights at the national level, because what we see happening for a lot of these communities is that there's these hurdles put into place saying you cannot have these land rights until you're officially recognized as an indigenous community. So there's not a whole lot of the law was passed, or the constitutional court passed it, but there were all these hurdles put into place so that it would be very, very difficult for it to be implemented. Right. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Rebecca. As most people here who are familiar with Indonesia know the situation you described is an extremely complicated one, and one that really requires enormous work to resolve in some sort of consistent way. So thank you very much for illustrating that in your particular case studies. We'll come back to some of those issues subsequently. We're halfway through the panel presentation, so if we have time to stretch, chat to your neighbour briefly. This is the time after lunch when Australian students tend to nap a little bit. I'm sure that nobody here does that, but just to let you know it's officially allowed to stretch and, Good. So, Rebecca mentioned title to her presentation. In one of the presentation reflected on the tension between people and conservation, between livelihoods and conservation outcomes and synergies that we might develop there. That's a good segue to Magilla's presentation, which is looking at moving to the north to Peninsular Malaysia and looking at conservation outcomes as a consequence of federalism. So, Magilla, welcome.
Thank you for coming. First of all, I'd like to apologize for my voice. Not feeling too good, but I think I can do this.
Okay, we'll send out for emergency garb or something if need be.
Right, so just like Rebecca, I've amended the title of my presentation a bit. So I'm basically looking at how policy innovations happen in Malaysia. So the title of my presentation would be Policy Innovation in Malaysia's Central Forest Pine Policy. It's quite an elaborate policy, and it's been there for about almost a decade now. But a lot of people don't really know what is Central Forest Pine. Even a lot of Malaysians don't know what is Central Forest Pine. So the basic outlines to my research will be, I will introduce you to a research context, because what I'm presenting today is just a small fraction of my PhD work. The political structure and environmental federalism in Malaysia itself. Who are the network of actors who are involved with forestry and conservation, also wildlife. The policy implementation outcome and how the policy is innovated, and powers within implementing actors, as well as the conclusion. So the larger context of my research actually looks at how federalism, which is broken down further into division of powers, division of finances, and intergovernmental relations, influence the policy implementation. And so I plugged in Central Forest Pine as a case study to look at how the implementation outcomes comes about. Who are the different players? How do power balances occur? How do they network with each other? And so today's presentation will be just one small part here, which is power. We'll just be looking at who are the different players, what are the powers embedded in them, and how an implementation actually happens or does not happen. Right. So as part of an introduction, what I'm trying to say is that policy implementation often goes hand in hand with policy innovation. So policy implementation itself, it's basically just translation of decisions into actions. It may be translated, or when policy makers actually come up with policies, they think, oh, we've put it down on paper. When it goes down to the field, it can be translated just like that. But oftentimes when it goes down on the field, that's not what happens, and policies can be innovated to favor a community, favor a certain implementing actor, or even just favor the policy itself. And what I looked at is the political structure, how that actually influences policy implementation and the implementing actors. So I'm sure most of you already know, so Malaysia is a federal state. It practices top-down policy making. That means the federal government makes most of the policies. It hands it down to the states, hoping that the states would implement it. So subnational units are responsible to implement the policies, and often that is influenced by intergovernmental relations. So who governs at the federal level and who governs at the state level, and then how much finances do they get for every policy that they implement. But the catch with this is that we also have other federal bodies like National Land Councils, National Forest Councils, but often this council does not have incentives or punishments, penalties for not implementing a policy. So often everybody comes to the table and then they talk about what's going to be implemented, and then they say, okay, fine, we'll do it, but nobody gives a timeline, and then they all walk off. All right, so the federal environmental federalism in Malaysia is governed by 3 lists according to our constitution. So on a federal list, we have fisheries, control of pesticides, and pest protection. And then on the state list, they've got land, land improvement and soil conservation, agriculture, and forestry. On the concurrent list, both the federal government and the state government will have to govern the production of wild animals and birds, as well as the management of national parks. But then, the federal government also legislates policies pertaining to land and forest governance through National Land Council and National Forest Council. That's what I mentioned before. They make policies and they have all the mechanisms, but it doesn't work as effectively as it should. So what is Central Forest Fund? So this is the map that you see. 1, 2, 3, 4 is the remaining chunks of major forests, which is still pristine in Peninsular Malaysia. So a policy was enacted in 2006 after Malaysia signed on Convention of Biological Diversity in 1998 to actually try to connect these chunks of forest to form a spine so that major wildlife such as elephants and tigers, which Malaysia is important to, will be able to move around this area. And if later on, idealistically, if Thailand wants to work with us, we can even connect the forest up to the greater part of Asia. So it involves 8 out of 11 peninsular Malaysian states, aims to re-establish contiguity of forest covers. It has a comprehensive implementation plan. So the World Bank has applauded Malaysia for coming up with this policy, but of course it was not implemented properly, or not yet. Alright, so these are the 4 areas. If anybody know the ranges in Malaysia, these are very important spinal forest chunks that we've got. Siti Wangsa, Bintang Nakawan, Taman Negara, the Eastern Range, Southeast Pahang, Chini and Vera. This is where the bauxite mining, if you are aware of environmental issues in Malaysia, is happening now. And now Romping Park and Kluang Wildlife Reserves. So these are some of the animals that Malaysia is important to. The Malayan tiger was only found distinct in 2006. Before that, we thought the Malayan tiger was Sumatran tiger, and so we never cared about it. Yeah. So 2006, and that's where we all got scared. Oh, we've got tigers now, and they're different. Oh, let's do something about it. We've got Asian elephants, hornbills. I'll talk about it later. There's one area that we actually conserved, and then it was found that 12 different types of hornbills actually was spotted after the place was reforested. We have gars, we have tapirs, and so on and so forth. So why was the policy in place? Looking at Malaysia, which has always been going down the path of timber logging and development for such a long time, agriculture, especially palm oil, and we're still going big on palm oil. That's because after the 1998 CBD, Malaysia never rectified a lot of it because they said, hey, look, world will do this, but yet we are losing our forest and we don't know what to do. So from 2000 to 2012, Malaysia lost 14.4% of its remaining forest cover. So that's a lot. Translate that into a map, you have all these things there. The black spots that you see is the same forest pine that I projected to you just now. So this is Malaysia now in 2012. We've had a slight increase by a few percentage, but then it's not much. It's still about the same. So what do the federal level implementers do, or what actually allowed them to actually implement the policy? So the federal level implementers, using the Article 94(1) in the Malaysian Constitution, allowed them to have a policy innovation. So they said, okay, we're going to use this, and we're going to make a policy where the states can be tied down to something where they'll conserve as much as they actually log. So Article 94 says the federal level implementers can educate, create awareness, offer advice, supply technical aid, and share research outcomes and the state implementers, especially agricultural and state forestry officers, shall accept any professional advice given to government of their state under this clause. Right? The federal level implementers have projected high level of commitment in enticing states to implement this policy. So we've got a $10.68 million fund from UNDP to do the project, where a lot of this money has been funded into building viaducts across major highways so wildlife can move. Also, there has been an empowerment study going on where forests and wildlife officers are brought in and trained again to be more accountable to their jobs and be more responsible. But then, over a period of time between the previous election, which is 2013, until last year, 2015, we had a minister who was not bothered about environment at all. So he was basically working on his political gains, and he was not bothered about what's happening in the office. So, of course, he never tried to push the state leaders to implement the policy. So, what happened at the state level? Again, the same thing. They came to the meetings where National Forest Council or National Land Council, and they discuss a lot of matters, and they go like, okay, I'll do it, but I don't know when I feel like it. The policy has implementing strategies which covered partnership between federal and state governments. So conservation is not cheap, we all know. So the federal government proposed that they will give some of the funds, and the states will have to fork out some of their funds. And the state already gets funds for training and empowerment through every year's budget. And the gazettement of forest reserves and acquisition of lands, forest management, establishing wildlife crossings by putting up signages at major highways, also building eco-viaducts, which could be an underpass below whatever road networks that we've already got, or overpass, which is an aerial pass for smaller mammals like monkeys or squirrels. Create riparian corridor where all farms or businesses who owns land are told to provide an area for animals to cross. Also land management control and monitoring. But the challenge with this policy was definitely not, most of the agencies at the state level claimed that they were not consulted before the policy was made. But that was actually not true because they were consulted, maybe not, but the change of hands in bureaucracy actually made them claim that. And the new policy conflicts with existing development plans, so they've already given away land to be developed by some other parties, and lack of financial resources. So in my PhD research, I actually picked all the 8 states and I looked at various variables. One of it was who's the head of state, and I looked at Sultan, who's the ruling party, whether they had a significant approach to implementation. What's the area of coverage? How large is it? How many districts are involved? How important the area is for wildlife, whether there were big mammals or only small mammals, and whether there were economic corridors nearby, whether they had finances to implement, and whether there were indigenous people in the pockets of forest. And so if you can see here, these are all the outcomes that was already there. And then I picked 4 states in the beginning, 2 which was governed by a ruling party which was the same as the federal government, and 2 which was governed by the opposition party at the state government. And then we had a major flood in 2014, and so I had to put that state in because it was also governed by the opposition state, just to see what was going on. So in the end I had 5 states, and these 3 were found unsuccessful, so they've not implemented the policy. When they were asked why, they've mentioned that they see no proven benefits with the policy. There's no scientific or factual facts that was provided by the federal government. Both lacked funding, so Kelantan and Terengganu, it's a standstill, they don't do anything about it, they're not bothered, it doesn't exist in their state. They're highly reliant on income from timber logging and industries, that's basically wood industries as well. Poor commitment by state governments, they don't even need to discuss if there's a way forward or there's anything they can do about it. And poor environmental knowledge levels among state leaders or politicians. In fact, in the first state, Kelantan, the state ESCO who had the environmental portfolio didn't even know there was an exit or an entrance to the national park from their state. Right? For Pahang, it's implemented on paper. In fact, Pahang is the state that we've got biggest and the most number of environmental issues on, where the bauxite mining is, where the rare earth mining is, rare earth plant is. And they've said that they've lacked funding. They're highly reliant on income on timber, logging industries as well. Poor commitment by state governments and poor environmental knowledge among state bureaucrats. So the state leaders and politicians are aware of the environmental impacts and the harm that it brings to the society, but they just want to gain money out of it. So the bureaucrats are not doing anything because they know there's no point learning about it because someone at the top will actually tell you not to do it. And then you have two states, before that. So Kelantan is ruled by the opposition state, while Terengganu and Pahang is ruled by the same political party as the federal government. So it's Barisan Nasional in these both states, and it's Parti Islam Malaysia in Kelantan. And then you have two states which have successfully implemented it. This is the part where you see how they've innovated the policy. They also didn't have a lot of funds, but they've increased reforestation activities by engaging NGOs. In Perak, there was a strict control over land openings and timber latex planting within forest areas. So at national levels, they were allowed 20% that they could plant timber latex clone within forest areas. But in Perak, and Perak state leadership said, no, we are not going to do 20%. We are going to do only 5%. And they also had a degraded land turned into permanent forest reserve. And they ventured into carbon credits and crowdfunding, established closer working relationships with NGOs, and environmental knowledge was found to be high among state leadership and bureaucrats. In Selangor, it's similarly the same. The state ESCO who holds the environmental portfolio is an environmentalist herself. So she has a lot of dialogues with NGOs. And then when the opposition political party came into power in 2008, they introduced a moratorium on logging. That means no logging for 25 years. And they also introduced a moratorium on hunting of 5 major species that would be food for tigers and elephants. They established a closer working relationship with NGOs, and environmental knowledge was high, and they redesigned the CFS mapping. So the original mapping which was provided to them, they realized that they can't do it because the land which was on the original map was taken away already. It's being used by someone else. So they found another way to connect the remaining forest chunks. So they practically redesigned the map. So this is one example of policy innovation that happened in Perak. So when this highway was built, there was 1.5 kilometers of land on each side which was degraded because of the construction. And so the state government realized that they could actually, in their prerogative, reforest this area and form a link to the remaining forest chunks. So, cool, finish. So state level implementers, what do? They actually just serve their political masters. Whoever pays them, that's what they do. So for state forestry departments, they actually work for the state. So if state level, state governments are keen to implement the policy, they will implement. If they're not, then they don't do anything about it. The wildlife officers, which are relevant officers, they work according to the federal government. So they try their best to implement the CFS policy in their prerogative. The working committee, which is set up at state levels, do discuss and try to come up with a platform to identify issues that they can work on. And the state agencies are able to decide on implementation strategies collectively. And this is where they negotiate with the federal implementers. So these are the political parties. So it is found that there is no significance because it's basically whether the state wants to implement or not. Whether the state is governed by an opposition political party or governed by the party which is similar to, which is the same to federal government, that makes no significance to them. And sultans. So what is the role of sultans? Historically, they are known for hunting as part of their activities or hobbies. They are trained for it. They had absolute power over land and forest before Malaya was colonized. they've had history of timber demands concessions in the 1980s. So the last work which was done on sultans and their demands for timber was by Sheikh Hussein Ali in 1990s when Tun Mahathir wanted to limit the powers of sultans. And so after that, nobody revisited the whole literature. Nobody could tell how much powers sultans do have. But in my research, I picked up that one as well. So it was found that some sultans do play an influential role. Some actually have pledged as patrons to forests because they like it, and they are the new generation. They have decreed in their speeches that environment is important, and so we have to take care of it. But we also have some royal families which have set up environmental trusts, arms or NGOs, but it's controversial. So for instance, the Pahang Sultan has set up Sultan Ahmad Shah Environmental Trust, but this trust is an NGO who went to the state government and requested for 5,000 acres of land for them to do palm oil plantation so that they can have enough money to fund their environmental fund. So that's very controversial. And then you have the Yayasan Sultan Mizan by Sultan Terengganu. He claims to be very pro wildlife, and he likes to look for poachers. But then he has recently established an elephant village where elephants can do circus-like acts, and it's totally against the new 2010 Conservation of Wildlife Act policy that Malaysia just implemented. So the conclusion, cases of Perak and Selangor depict the case of a sustaining innovation. That means they don't go far off from the previous systems. They try to innovate they're still a bit more comfortable. So they just do whatever they can. But if there is no push towards that direction, there's no funding, when that runs out, they'll probably go back to where they were before. Because these are not disruptive innovations where they break down the whole system and start with a new one. So state governments are still able to generate sufficient revenue for the state, and sultans are still able to obtain land under a formal process out of the central forest fire. So although funding by federal government can be a catalyst, state governments are the veto power in CFS policy implementation, and political party relations does not influence the implementation of CFS policy. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Those of us who are from federal systems or monarchies or both, I think can relate to some of the points that you made, and of course they're also more general in terms of the tensions between different levels of government. So again, thanks for that. We'll come back to some of those points in the discussion. I did note one of the points you made was that at one time your environment minister had not been supportive of the initiative. Many of you would know that Australia's environment minister, Greg Hunt, was awarded the World's Best Minister award 2 months ago, and we'd like to loan him to you. Our last panellist, Blair Freeman, is going to talk about a landscape approach, and many of you would know that that language is being used now to describe ways of thinking about how to resolve some of the tensions between different land uses on the landscape scale. So Blair, thank you everyone.
Peter, thank you everyone for your interest and the opportunity to be here today. Just like to start with a short note of preface. My presentation today is not sort of primary research in any way. It's more a set of consultant perspectives on contemporary forest governance models and some observations on initiatives that are operating, particularly in Indonesia, but drawing a little bit on Australia and other countries as well. So not primary research, but I hope it's a useful sort of contribution to the sort of the broader framework that we're operating in, and I think it dovetails in that way with some of the other presentations today. So just quickly starting with the problem that problems that we're here to sort of address today. Really sort of thinking about what are the issues here in developing countries around forest governance. Well, I think a number of these points that I'm just listing here have been well covered already in the last day and a half. Deforestation's been continuing at very high levels. When I first started working in Indonesia a few years ago, it had just overtaken Brazil on levels of deforestation, 500,000 hectares a year, that's there's a range of other countries that are sort of in that sort of bracket. Related issues of smoke haze, biodiversity loss, CO2 emissions, we then sort of lead into a sort of a range of underlying factors that drive this, and much more broadly, the research community and government and industry have been trying to address what are the underlying causes, drivers of deforestation. Rebecca's talked about some key issues today on sort of land tenure and confusion about rights. Abita's talked about the issues of timber legality, illegal logging, and the related sort of issues there. I think we sort of then get into issues of sectoral approaches, projects that are coming in and focusing within a jurisdiction, or trying to address a particular issue in the forest industry or the palm oil industry, and then we've got this sort of overlay, of course, in developing countries of short-term cash drivers rather than sort of longer-term investments in capital. If we think about it in a financial context, that's sort of drawing down on the cash rather than sort of building that capital and living off the interest of the principal over time. Weak governance, I think Rebecca's covered that sort of really well today in terms of sort of issues, underlying issues of land tenure and confusion. And I think there's been a push in recent years to sort of try and link up green supply chains, because there's been this lack of linkages between sort of smallholders and larger supply chains that can make responsible decisions, and that's what sort of responsible sourcing is all about. But there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. So they're the sort of broadly the problems and underlying factors that prompt this sort of presentation, and thinking about, well, what are the frameworks that we're using to address these issues. And my observation over the last few years is the contemporary paradigm, or the main catch cry at international forums here is the landscape approach, and we're seeing that, so perhaps it's expressed most prominently through the Global Landscapes Forum that's been running since 2013. The Centre for International Forestry Research has done a lot of work sort of in this area and made a vast contribution. And then there's NGOs such as Conservation International, which I've been aligned with over the last few years, that have prepared handbooks about sustainable landscapes and the landscape approach. So what is the landscape approach? There is a range of definitions out there that you might be familiar with, and it's a rich array of sort of aspects that need to be considered. I would come back to perhaps one of the most sort of well-cited references in this area is the work that Jeff Sayer and Terry Sunderland and colleagues did back in 2012. They came up with what was called the 10 principles for reconciling competing land uses, and really it's those competing land uses that give rise to the need for a landscapes approach. In the interest of time, I don't want to sort of dwell on those 10 principles, and I think sort of perhaps around the room, if I just get a show of hands of people of familiarity with these principles or the landscape approach. That's good. Yeah, so I think there's recognition of this paper and this sort of concept, but I think the 10 principles give a clear sense of the number of aspects and the requirement for mutual reinforcing sort of initiatives, such as recognising it's a dynamic process, hence continual learning and adaptive management. You need this common concern, entry point to sort of galvanise stakeholders. Scales in this terminology relates to the fact that you need to recognise that issues at a particular level, call it a provincial level, are impacted by what's happening at national policy level, and then from the bottom up, impacted by what's happening at district level. So there's multiple scales that need to be considered, multiple functions across the landscape. It's all about multiple stakeholder engagement and working through to try and minimise trade-offs, lose-lose sort of trade-offs in particular, and win-lose trade-offs, and as Peter touched on earlier today, trying to sort of generate synergies by working together across sectors with stakeholders across the landscape. Okay, I was going to sort of touch on adaptive management. I might just sort of roll through this one sort of really quickly. I just wanted to draw that link to other work, other models that have been developed over time. Adaptive management, my researching on it sort of links back to sort of North America in particular. Sort of Canadians and Americans have developed this for US sort of forest service areas, and it really links back to the 10 principles that were described before. And principle 1 is around continual learning, adaptive management. It's particularly applied where you've got some uncertainty about the outcome of the interventions that you might need to put in place. So rather than not taking proactive action, it's setting some objectives with stakeholders, putting that intervention in place, and then monitoring that over time, being prepared to come back and revisit it. So, adaptive management is in my mind, it dovetails with the landscape approach. The other one I just wanted to sort of raise here is the work by the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is, in my view, gaining sort of traction in different parts of the world, in Indonesia, also in Africa. I think the key element I want to sort of raise here is the focus of the TFA process of creating a structured governance sort of process that brings together the public sector, private sector and civil society, while respecting the sovereign right of the respective government. The TFA process effectively gets those governments to sign into a declaration, commit themselves to a process, which then brings together a round table of those different parties, which can then inform government in an ongoing way. And they start with a national workshop, identifying key issues for all stakeholders, and then agreeing as best they can through consensus a set of action items that the separate entities around that table might pursue over time, and then monitoring. So I think the Tropical Forest Alliance is starting to do some very good work in that governance initiative of bringing those multiple parties together, and then assisting government to make those decisions in respect of reducing deforestation. So another, based on that sort of quick overview of some contemporary models for forest governance and broadly the landscape approach, I just wanted to introduce this project that I've been working with over the last 3 years. The Sustainable Landscapes Partnership is a sustainable development project managed by Conservation International, has been funded by USAID and also philanthropic sort of funding over the last 5 years. It looks to effectively act on the landscape approach, and it's working in North Sumatra and also West Papua. A feature of the SLP program is that it sees sort of 4 key pillars that need to be sort of addressed through the landscape approach. So really SLP and Conservation International try to sort of simplify it down, if you like, to sort of 4 key areas to focus, and they need to be mutually reinforcing. So what is your sort of governance structures? And this is where I would link back to the TFA process of bringing together government, private sector, civil society, providing an ongoing forum where they engage and they enable the respective parties to take actions and then hold them accountable. As Akila sort of talked about in Malaysia, it's making sure that then they agree on something and then they go away and make that happen. So strong focus on participatory engagement in that governance pillar. Natural capital, it's really about, at a jurisdictional level, identifying the reservoirs of natural capital. What are those forests, catchment areas that give rise to ecosystems on which sustainable production systems are based? And once you've identified those natural capital values, then putting effective protection measures around those. Once you've done that, you can start to sort of focus on that sustainable production. I think SLP's been doing a very good job on identifying issues, particularly around the boundaries of natural capital, sort of recognising that you can't try to reserve an area and keep encroachment out if the surrounding villages don't have sustainable livelihoods, if they've got, if they're close to the poverty line and you've taken away access to the forest, or you're asking them to do that, then what replaces that? So sort of things that SLP is doing training for farmers in cocoa, coffee, sort of rubber, and sustainable practices that can coexist with your natural capital goals. And lastly, human well-being is that sort of also all important sort of pillar. How do we ensure that we're addressing all those needs of those stakeholders? So addressing all of those things in that way should, in a complex construct, look to address these interrelated challenges we've talked about. So then I just want to, really the last part of my presentation is sort of three key examples of policy innovation in respect of forest governance, and they arise from the SLP project in Indonesia, and I'd like to sort of put these forward as things to sort of think about in terms of where is sort of forest governance going. So the first one is West Papua committing to establishing a conservation province. This happened late last year. Many of you will be familiar with that. October last year it was declared through regulation by the provincial government and recognised by the national government. There's also been a lot of work done on a vision for that conservation province. So to a large extent that's been articulated. We're looking for the protection of customary rights over natural resources. We want to develop industries that are complementary to a conservation province. So for those who might not be familiar with this, it's important to recognise that a conservation province doesn't exclude developments of activity in any way. Clearly for Papua, as for the rest of Indonesia, economic development is fundamentally important, but it needs to be done in a way that is compatible with this aspiration. I think other sort of key features of this is recognising the incredible marine diversity sort of around Papua. Something like, or more broadly, 60% of plants sort of found nowhere else on Earth. I think it's something like sort of 50% of marine sort of species have sort of found in this Papuan area, unique species in this area around West Papua. So as a result, a very strong focus on ridge to reef type management that needs to be recognised in this conservation province. Now this is very early days. That was declared at the end of 2015, so we're not in a position to say how is West Papua delivered on that and what have been sort of the results. But I think it's an example for me of a very bold policy statement and a commitment. The West Papua province has worked closely with NGOs that have assisted that process that I spoke about, like the Tropical Forest Alliance, one to step through have a round table of government, private sector, civil society to say this is our vision, this is what we want to do. Can we commit to that? Yes, let's commit to that. Now we've got to work through the detailed implementation. What are those activities, those economic development activities that we're going to do that are compatible? That's still ahead of West Papua, but I think this is an exciting one to watch. Second of our three examples is work that SLP's been doing on trying to promote and establish fiscal incentives for forest conservation in Indonesia. And this is based on the observation by Conservation International that in Indonesia there isn't any explicit sort of financial value attributed to forest cover at a district or provincial level. And this is in contrast to a number of other countries around the world that have sort of moved to place that value on forest cover and to influence policy decisions as a result. And we would cite sort of Brazil as an example of that, also Ecuador, and then most recently, I'm not sure if you might have seen coverage of this over the last year, but India has made a fairly substantial investment in horizontal devolution, as they call it, essentially tying a central government budget allocation to those states of India on a metric that is just simply sort of forest cover and minimising forest cover change. So before any other sort of decisions about a development of a forest area and the sort of trade-off between the return from clearing an area or converting that area to another sort of land use enterprise, there is a value that's subscribed and there's money flowing sort of for forest being conserved. So that's absent in Indonesia. We've been developing a concept note that's sort of based on recognising, as well as population, as well as infrastructure, let's also look at what is the forest cover and what is the rate of change of forest cover at a subnational level, and then looking at some form of regional developments and funding that flows. Thanks, Peter. So the last one is just to sort of share this development with you around what we've sort of been calling a landscape accounting framework. This is work that Conservation International has been doing sort of more broadly outside of Indonesia, but we've been sort of piloting it in North Sumatra. Really, it's based directly on the sort of landscapes approach, which starts with bringing together your stakeholders, identifying what are the key issues in respect of your natural capital, your lack of sustainable production systems, your well-being, and then with those stakeholders looking to reach a consensus on what is a desirable future in that respect, what are those objectives, and then, and this is perhaps the most challenging aspect to date, is linking that with performance metrics that can be tracked over time using ideally public data sets. And this has been a sort of key focus of the work in Indonesia, is rather than a project or a program like SLP coming up with metrics and its own data, we want to sort of link it back to credible sort of public data sets or things like the sort of the tracking of forest cover. That's sort of out of University of Maryland. So credible data sources that can't be challenged sort of at a high level, and then monitoring those over time. And that's something you do through stakeholder engagement. And then taking that to a next level of transparency is developing an online dashboard and a scorecard that you could sort of have at a subnational level. So this graphic here is an example of some preliminary work of the dashboard that you might look at for a region of Indonesia. And we look at sort of indicators of natural capital, such as rate of deforestation, number of fires per year, the percentage of sort of key species sort of observations that have been made. Then there's some work that's been done on metrics that you could use for production, and this has been a sort of fairly complicated area to make that meaningful, but looking to sort of track indicators of productivity for sustainable production systems. And then on the far right are measures of human well-being, and they can be things like the Human Development Index, how's that sort of changing, poverty and life expectancy, levels of education. The key point is that you agree on what are the objectives with a broad base of stakeholders at the landscape level, at a jurisdictional level. You set objectives with those stakeholders, then you establish performance indicators that people sort of say, yep, that's reasonable, and then these can be tracked over time, and that gives you some metrics-based assessment of progress over a long period. So my key messages here are that the landscape approach, for those who may not be so familiar with it, it's calling for a more holistic and more integrated approach to managing natural resources. I think that really sort of builds on the presentations before mine today. It's what is the landscapes approach? It's essentially an ongoing process of broad stakeholder engagement, and we'd see it as all about, with those stakeholders, setting goals and then establishing performance indicators that stakeholder group can are comfortable with to track over time. There are working models of policy innovation that I think we can see within the landscape approach in Indonesia and elsewhere. And I've just listed here sort of some of the areas where I sort of think there's further work that needs to be done. Obviously, it's one thing for West Papua to say, let's become a conservation province, another thing to sort of deliver that and show that that's a working model. So that's a really sort of key one there. My example about fiscal incentives is what we might call sustainable financing that can support decisions about land use and having a bias for forest conservation. Obviously, the landscape accounting framework is something that we'd like to see. At the moment, it's at a pilot stage for North Sumatra. We'd like to see that replicated and tested in other provinces. And that sort of feeds into sort of reporting up through the levels from sub-national level to national level. And the last one is just to note that, of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were finalised late last year, and I think there's further work that can be done on linking the landscape accounting framework directly to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank
Thank you.
So, I'm going to ask the panellists all to come and take a seat up front, and that's another opportunity for a bit of stretch. And Jill Pekrovsky will offer a few reflections on what we've heard, and then we'll take questions and discussion. So just give us time for the panellists to assemble. Jill will find a slide, and for you all to re-energise from sitting still and being quiet for so long. Thank you. Jill Pekrovsky.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can I talk from over here, which is a slightly sort of give you a different angle on the for your necks. It's a bit of a difficult room, isn't it? Thank you very much for asking me to just summarise a little and set the scene perhaps for discussion. I don't think I will go through each paper in turn summarising them because they were all so clear. I think they're very different. They're offering different perspectives. And we don't necessarily benefit from my summary of what all of you said. We've all got the abstracts to refer to. However, if I could just draw out some common themes that I think, from my perspective in the sort of research that we do in our group looking at evidence, linking science and policy, that might help frame the argument. And I'll explain why I've got that slightly curious picture in a moment. The first theme I thought, I can't work out how to make that bigger. Blair said something exceptionally interesting, and I thought would put all of Oxford out of a job immediately, and it will never happen. You talked about credible data sources that cannot be challenged. Well, that's a really great challenge, and I think I know what you mean. And all of the papers, all the presenters dealt with the issue of evidence and knowledge and what we need to know in order to progress the understanding of the policy situation that we're in. So I think I understand what you're saying, but as I'll explain in a minute why I think this picture is very relevant to what we're talking about, I think we sometimes get lost in detail, and we argue over, we have how many angels on the head of a pin type discussions where perhaps we need to pull back our lens. Peter said that he, me, and Jeff were no longer as young as we used to be. This is very true. But there's one thing that's remained clear ever since I was as young as my kids are now when I came to Oxford. A wonderful man, John Helms, who said, mean what you say and say what you mean. Define your terms, be very clear about what your terms are, and then make your presentation based on those. And don't try and stray out into discussions of things which you haven't defined. And I think all of the speakers were very clear about the lens with which they were looking at the problem that we're assembled here for. So John Helms remains just a great simple, clear thing that we should, as researchers, academics, practitioners, and consultants think about. Just being very clear about our own lens, and perhaps modest about the lens that we're looking at. So before I say where that comes from in this, I was reading a paper from last year's set of papers in the conference. I think there was a paper, One Eye on the Forest, One on the Market, and that links everything that people have been talking about here. We're not talking about theoretical policies for theoretical situations. There is a development agenda, there is a financial incentive, there are things other than conservation driving us. I come from a team where the first thing our professor in our research group, the long-term ecology group, says is, where can I do damage? Because we work on a lot of consultancies for companies that drill, that mine, that do damage to the environment and want to do less. So there's a reality there about where you can put your conservation and where you can put some of the things that the panel have been talking about. These interrelated challenges are a real issue for us all to describe. And that brings us to the issue of theory versus practice, which Abdillah and Rebecca talked about very nicely. What works in theory, what laws you have in theory may be completely blown apart in practice. You may have corruption and all the other things that the panelists have talked about. Power, who wields the power to weigh these different conflicts, was a subject that our panelists spoke about, and that's something I think is quite difficult. We might want to explore in the discussion. Participating in this process, I think we need to address something perhaps the panelists didn't, but I'm sure in their work they consider this. It's one step back. This policy change that we're looking at, who has said it's important? Who's participated in that part of the discussion to set the framing of the policy change? We have the participation in the implementation and perhaps the analysis, but how are we ensuring that people who count are participating in the decisions at the very beginning of the process? Who decided that, and how do we weigh those things? And the point of I think that links the presentations we heard, which were so interesting. This is a picture in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's called View from My Window by Camille Pissarro.
We'll have a field trip.
I think we should have a field trip. Not only is it describing a sort of landscape approach, there's lots of things going on in there. It's an example of this kind of art called pointillism. So if you go up very, very close in the Ashmolean, you can see that each one of these, this looks like a picture now. Actually, very close up, it's a series of dots. Small dots with single colours. And it occurred to me when we were doing these kinds of conferences that each of us is one of those dots. And it's blending together, you get an impression of something that actually the dots aren't themselves representing. So you can have, at the simplest example, two yellow dots together give an impression of orange. But actually, a yellow dot together with a red dot, but actually the yellow dot and the red dot are very different. They're different policies, they have to be analysed differently, different people contribute to them, and though we see them as orange, there's very specific needs for each of those dot colours. And it seemed to me that Pissarro had kind of got this whole participatory approach and the forest governance or governance approach quite nicely by his series of dots. And it's not just a broad brush approach, it is made up of a lot of very specific pieces of information. So I thought that might help set the agenda set the tone for the discussion. But it was fascinating. The 4 papers were absolutely fascinating. I hope I haven't mis-summarised anything you said. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Jill. Thank you for the talk. And I can see there's a title of a new forest policy paper awarded by the panel. So we've got about 20 minutes for discussion. Perhaps you could just say who you are briefly by way of introduction. We might take clusters of 2 or 3 questions starting over here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm a postdoctoral scholar from St. Anthony's.
And a little bit louder, sorry. It says
I'm
air
a
conditioning
postdoctoral
technology.
scholar from St. Anthony's College, Oxford. I have a question and an observation. Akila, I wanted to ask you, in a semi-democratic country like Malaysia, what is the role of community forestry? And what voice does the community have in decision making at the state level, at the local level, at the state level? And Rebecca, very interesting presentation. I think Blair mentioned India, and I think it would be an interesting example to look at, not because it's my own country, but because it will be an interesting example for you. Forest Rights Act 2006 is hugely controversial in India, primarily for 3 provisions. First, it says that land and forest rights can be given to scheduled tribes, but our constitution does not define scheduled tribes properly, and every state has its own definition. So you might be a scheduled tribe in one state, you move to the next state, you are not a scheduled tribe. Secondly, it says anybody can get land and forest rights if they can prove that their ancestors were there in the forest for 75 years. Now they don't have land documents, so who proves, whether they were there? And finally, they are eating into tiger core zones. So it brings them directly in conflict with tiger conservationists. There have been complaints that tigers are killing us, but tigers are actually behaving properly. The humans are intruding into tiger spaces. So.
Question next there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Craig Logan from the University of Melbourne. My question or my comment is directed to Abida, and thank you for an excellent paper. I have to admit that when it started, I was quite excited because you introduced some new acronyms with which I was not yet familiar with. Something new. You know, I've not heard of FLEGTs and VPAs, and particularly the V sexy, V legal. I love that. But I just have to say that as your presentation went on, very, very well organized, very succinct, very clear, but I just felt my enthusiasm plummeting. And I guess my question is, after at least 3 decades of attempts at developing and implementing some sort of a forest certification system in Indonesia. I believe I first heard about it from Emil Salim in 1986 when the Brundtland Commission paid a visit to Indonesia. We still haven't got it to work, it seems to me. And I just want to know from your paper, is there actually anything new? Has anything happened? Did I miss something? I guess that's me. Did I miss something?
Thanks, Craig. Is there one other question over here? Thanks.
I'm Liz Chidley. I'm a PhD candidate at UEA. I'd like to ask Rebecca for her opinion on this. It's rather a specific question. Sorry, Gillian. But the Constitutional Court ruling, the MK 35/12, it says that customary forests belong to indigenous peoples, not the state. And this is quite a radical change. I think there are a few signs, though, over the past 2 to 3 years that it's being implemented. I don't quite share your optimism, because rumour has it that there is strong opposition from what used to be the old Department of Forestry, and it's now the new Ministry of Environment and Forests, who are blocking this. And I'd like to ask for your opinion on, firstly, is this your understanding too? Is actually no buy-in from the old Ministry of Forestry, and that's really what's happening? And secondly, is this piece of legislation, MK 35/12, dead in the water, as indigenous communities are pushing for local legislation, perda, rather than trying to going down this other new route to secure their rights to forest lands?
Thanks, Liz. 3 questions. We'll start off with Akila, come to Abida, and then to Rebecca.
All right, thank you for your question. I think to answer that, I have to divide or categorize the states into what they are in terms of socio-economy. So states like Penang and Selangor, they are very highly developed, and the NGOs have mobilized themselves really well. They've got a platform. So in those states, you can really see an engagement between the community and the areas which are in conflict. But in states where there are other kinds of environmental issues, like say Pahang and Perak, where in Perak the forest was on the verge of being degazetted, then in Pahang the rare earth mining plus the bauxite mining, a lot of NGOs moved the communities around there to actually mobilize them in protest. But in all the other states, there's very little engagement or protest from the community. So they basically live very individualistic lives in terms of environment.
Thanks. Abida, did Craig miss something down there in Melbourne?
I'm not sure how much you know, so I don't know how much you
He knows
need.
a lot.
But I think I'm sorry to make you very pessimistic as well, based on the presentation. But it's we actually have a good discussion when we had a meeting in London 3 days ago with a group of researchers trying to understand the impact of flag PPA in Indonesia and other countries as well. and there is a, in that discussion, there is a certain debate. It's actually, is it a waste investment? Like after all of these years, the EU actually already invest for the what is it? The timber legality verification system in some countries. Is it a waste of investment? And based on that discussion, is actually in many ways the process of establishing the timber verification system itself has broadened the space for civil society to engage in the decision-making process, and also it has to some extent actually transformed the way like state-society relationship in decision-making process. But that process doesn't necessarily translate to the practices that the EU flag actually want to achieve. In the case of Indonesia, the discussion on the timber legality verification actually initially began with imagining a really broad system that could improve the forest governance, not just legality verification is one aspect of the forest governance, right? But the following years, based on our research, we see it's actually become reduced in a way that it was simplified, and it reduced become a system to certification system to verify legality, and it the responsibility handed over to the third-party auditors. And I have a discussion with Connie can add to the discussion as well. The problem with third-party auditors, there are many responsibilities that need to be tackled by the state that the third-party auditor cannot be performed, and it's actually not really fair to expect the third-party auditor to perform certain kind of responsibility that the state needs to perform, especially like for instance, based on the system, the auditors need to, if we want to improve the system, the auditors need to have the authority, the capacity to not only review the process of gaining the documentation, whether or not it involve corrupt practice or not, but also the ability to report if there is things happen, and also to some extent making the state act on it if there is certain irregularities that they found. But the problem is many of the auditors also not really well paid, so not so many auditors want to be engaged in the PLK verification. So it's only minimal number of auditors with limited scope of authority to do that.
Can we
Sure.
leave it there for now?
Sure.
I think Ange has spelled all.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Rebecca? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for both the information and the question. One thing that popped into my head about when you were mentioning the comparison between India, and thank you for that information, that's great, and I'll probably look into that for a comparison in the future. And one of the things you mentioned was this links to the link to the land, where the communities have to prove that they've been there in this particular place, and that's really problematic for communities like this that are semi-nomadic. And so once you have this formalization of rights around one particular piece of land, then you get into problems of movement, and so this is one of the things I'm actually co-authoring a paper right now with someone at the university and in Leiden, and we're looking at this, like, what is the problem with the formalization of rights as well. On your questions about the Ministry of Forestry, I would 100% agree that the Ministry of Forestry is really creating all these hurdles for communities to jump to have this implemented. It takes away a lot of the land under their jurisdiction, so of course they're going to be very reluctant to have any sort of implementation on it. And I think one of the things that I see happening is they are encouraging to some extent this controversy, or this they're pitting conservation against livelihood. So you have these groups that are NGOs for conservation, that they're against Mkatiga Lima to some extent because it turns over land to these indigenous communities, which then gives them the rights to sell concessions to gold mining, which is what I see happening in my case, is their small-scale gold mining. And so then those concessions are turned over to the communities rather than the Ministry of Forestry. So there's this stereotype that they're indigenous communities, they take care of their land, and I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at it. There's a lot more going on, and so yes, I would say that the Ministry of Forestry is using these kind of conflicts to its advantage to not implement Empathy-Golima. But I would disagree on what you stated about the PERDAs, and for those of you who don't know, these are district and provincial level recognition of indigenous status. And so a lot of these communities, in order, there's a stipulation that you have to have this recognition before Empathy-Golima can be applied. And so it's, I think, exactly what Jillian was saying. It's all these little points and not seeing the big picture. So all of these communities are scrambling to get their individual recognition. And so they're losing sight of the big picture, and that is happening. But they are seeing it as one step in the process to getting Empathy-Golima implemented within the country. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily stalling Empathy-Golima, but I think they see it as a one step in the process of it. Now the problem that I see happening with it is that the NGOs are getting involved in this, and so they are trying to help communities to go through the process of receiving this recognition. But the NGOs themselves are confused about how to go about it. So in this particular case, you have AMAN, HUMA, and RMI all telling the Kasapuan community members how to go about getting the recognition, and they all have different approaches. So one says, oh, go straight to the the president. You need a presidential decree. And this one says, oh, no, you need to go to the province and provincial governor leader in Labak, and then they can figure it out at the provincial level for both provinces. And then you have another NGO that's saying, oh, no, you need to do each step slowly, go to each district level official, we'll get it all figured out. So the communities are confused because the NGOs that are supposed to know what's going on are confused. So
thanks very much. Can we take another round? Thanks very much. Got time for, I think, 3 quick questions and 3 quick responses if there are. 1, 2, 3, 4 hands. And we'll start here with Connie, Jeff, Jonathan, and at the back. Yeah, Connie.
Yeah, quick question for Blair. You had mentioned one part of this very interesting project being fiscal incentives, and an example of in India. I'm not familiar with what they're doing now with this, but as I understand it, paying states based on their slowing deforestation, for example. Do you see any risks, given what we're talking about power balances, and we bring in large fiscal incentives? And has the project talked about anything like safeguards?
Just so process that, Jeff.
Yeah. Really aimed at Abida. I like Pizarro's pixels, and it's a great way of presenting all sorts of things. When you are trying to present or develop any sort of certification system, the whole history of certification has been bothered by what you do with the smallholder. How does he or she have an input to the system? In Europe, quite a lot of work went into group certification. In Indonesia and Malaysia, do you have to rely on the village, the headman community organization, or do individual stakeholders work together?
Thanks, Jeff. John?
Yeah, seeing if I could do this quickly. I'll start by saying I've generally worked on forests, so this was probably something you guys have all thought about, but it struck me that listening to you, Abida was kind of saying, I think there's not enough law. Rebecca was saying there's too much law, and Peter was saying that the law is ineffective.
Well summarised.
And I think Blair was kind of saying we need to go beyond law. But then I was kind of thought, as I was listening to you, I was thinking maybe legislation and law is not the issue. And then I was thinking of Gillian's picture. This is probably something which foresters always say. It's, there's a danger of losing sight of the wood for the trees. And that, of course, if you get down to the little points, you don't see the big picture. And I work on kind of development interventions, and I would say in most areas of development, like health, education, we kind of know what we want to do. The question is, how do you do it? So you want to build schools, reduce mortality, all that kind of stuff. And it strikes me that what we're working at here is that we're arguing about what we're trying to do, not just how we do it. And you know, a lot of the reasons why the laws don't work, or they're too many, or they're not enough, or whatever it happens to be, is because it's the what question that we just don't know. You know, are we sustaining livelihoods? Are we protecting animals? Are we? And it all kind of comes together in this kind of miasma of conflict. And maybe that's why we've got 40 years of, you know, arguments from selling Brundtland on, and we seem to be getting nowhere. In that, at a very basic level, we don't know what we're trying to do. But so I don't know. There's a question now. I don't know if that kind of rings true. It's a sort of open thought, and I don't know if it works really.
Thanks very much, Sean. Very stimulating thought. And at the back, sorry, at A&A.
The last comment reminded me of the title of article, Deforestation in Indonesia, but slogan to do with it, which I think is kind of tricky. My question is just a tiny dot question to the first speaker. You mentioned there was about 10% or less than 10% of tenure clarity. I was wondering, is that an agreed figure, and what is that based on?
Okay, so let's just start with the response to specific questions. Blair first, and then the leader, and then no. Okay. So
thanks, Connie. The safeguards. Very early days with what we've done on the concept note. One quick response is that which we work through with the Ministry of Finance, as it has in India and Brazil and others, and it's a composite allocation of budgets, a composite of a range of aspects you're trying to sort of incentivise, forest being one of them. So it's not, so you shouldn't get any sort of bursts or sort of big swings. The other, what we are sort of looking at is threshold levels, maintaining forest cover within at a sort of a level, rather than sort of and then bands that you might have, rather than a 2% increase or a 2% decrease having a massive swing on the amount of budget allocation that's flowing. So it's recognition in the budget process of the importance of supporting forest conservation, but being aware of perverse outcomes, still working on safeguards.
Avida, there's a couple of points, then I'll offer the panel a chance to reflect on Jonathan's observations and we'll close.
I have several questions. Maybe Con can help you later. But I want to address answer your question on the smallholders engagement in the certification. There are several levels of engagement. One is engagement in the process of establishing the system itself. When the timber legality verification system is established, it takes 6 years of multi-stakeholder processes on envisioning what kind of system they want to have in Indonesia, and it was quite a participatory process in a way that civil society mostly represented in the process, and some representative of the smallholders. But I cannot say it's sufficient enough, because many of them doesn't really understand the language of certification, so they cannot participate meaningfully in the establishment of the system. That's the first level of engagement, and the other level of engagement is with certification engaging the smallholders. When SPL was initially designed, it includes the smallholders in requirement to get the field legal documentation, and they need to, it actually allow them to apply in a group. So some of the smallholder actually apply certification in a group. Certificate, like in an association of smallholders, to apply for one certification, because the price is so much. So they apply for that, but the problem with that is really highly depend on the assistance from the donors, especially in Indonesia case mostly from the UK program, multi-stakeholder forest partnership program. And the other problem is that after they got the certification, they need to have another additional fund for surveillance, and mostly they don't have the resources for that. So there are two different levels of engagement, and I hope that explains, answer your question. And
the second question?
The second question on the tenure clarity, that is mostly I think from the government sources, and mostly actually rely on government sources, mostly on the conservation areas, because conservation area need to when they they need to map and also to clarify all of the boundaries of the conservation area. If the boundaries has been mapped and also ground checks by the government mostly actually, and they said it's clear. But I cannot say that it has been agreed by other stakeholders, especially for the communities living in and around conservation area or forest area. So this is actually from that study. So it's still really debatable if it is 10%. I think the number can be much lower than that.
And in a way, as a response to one part of Jonathan's point, I think about agreement or lack of agreement. Did anybody else want to comment on that particular point before we close, very briefly? I think there's a lot to talk about over after tea.
Yes. But just really quickly, Jonathan, to say, I think the landscapes approach, the approach under the landscapes approach would be, and this will sound like oversimplifying, but to bring all the stakeholders in that room to sort of workshop effectively what, and distill down what are the key objectives for this particular sort of landscape, this jurisdictional sort of area. That's a very challenging task, but I've been in sort of workshops where over 3 days with government, private sector, civil society in that room sort of study. We've got all these issues, you put them all up on the wall, and then you start sort of saying, well, can we group these together, and these ones are issues, these ones are underlying factors, and it's that sort of somewhat tedious process sometimes of just trying to bring all that together. But that is the essence, I think, of the landscape approach, is trying to get that miasma into some sort of structured sort of form around this is key pillars or key objectives that we're going to anchor our strategic development around.
Ray, you had a closing remark?
Well, just on that point, I mean, I think that's a really good starting point. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. What was missing across all of the speakers for me was the feedback loop in our acts of governing. There's a great trap that we, across the globe, are going to fall into, a huge reporting industry going off to the SDGs without enacting local governance mechanisms which enact feedback from all of those enterprises and activities that have been built in appropriately.
Well, there's an agenda for further discussion as well. Look, we could keep on talking. We need to stop so we can have a break before the next session, and also allow Jill to take us on a field trip to the actual land and see the original Bizarro. It's only 10 minutes walk. It's been a great session. Thank you. Lots more to talk about. Thank you for being part of it. Please join me in thanking the panel and Jill.